6. That's how many iPhones were at the house at 1122 King Road the night of the crime in 2022. Nothing may have been found on Mr. Kohberger's phone, but this researcher seems to have uncovered what the iPhones actually saw. And boom isn't a big enough word to describe the impact. The Smart Things Find feature felt like the best initial fit, and from a technical perspective, the feature would have certainly placed Mr. Kohberger at the crime scene, but a few very small but nagging details didn't fit for me. The most nagging small doubt, though, kept me up at night and kept me digging. It's in Idaho versus Kohberger Rebuttal Expert Disclosure S3, which is mostly fluff from a digital forensic perspective. But the disclosure also makes a vague reference to subsequent extracted data examined, which, since subsequent in this context means after the device extractions, and the word data means that it isn't a physical drive extraction. The initial extraction occurred in December 2022, shortly after Mr. Kohberger was arrested. Cellebrite started their examination subsequent to that date in March or April of 2023. So, the statement is about data that is outside of a normal forensic extraction, and from the context of the follow-up question, is data that's potentially stored on another device. Another device? But not just any other device, but potentially one that had also been collected for forensic investigation in this case. There were only a handful of phones collected at the house based on the evidence list, and these were all iPhones. Is there some kind of data that an iPhone could see generated by an offline Android at the time of the crime? At the time of the crime is important because although iPhones have been able to see Android Find My Device beacons since iOS 17.5 released in May 2024, the crime occurred in November 2022. I had to know more. The internet said no, not possible, not even plausible that an iPhone would have been able to see an Android Find My Device beacon in November of 2022, long before iOS 17.5 was released. So I went back to the video of the Cellebrite investigators discussing the Idaho4 case and searched for any sort of additional clue, and the clue was right there in the seminar.
I know Josh Hickman was mentioned in the thing. Josh, where you at?
He's hiding. Where he's
Wave your hand. Where is he?
There he is.
That guy needs a ton of credit. So my approach on trying to figure out anything with the Android was I went to Josh's blog and just started basically relearning all these files and what they do and their behaviors and what they're supposed to have in them. But then, right as we lead up to the days of the crime about to happen, he went in and turned off his Wi-Fi on his phone. So he didn't want it to connect to anything, which is quite odd. That was a file that is not understood by us. It was a random thing, and it was a text to Josh like, hey, I'm seeing this file, this is what the log looks like, I don't understand it, but I think it might be this, and Josh said, I got you. And he starts testing.
They made a shout out to Josh Hickman and his blog, which delves into investigations and detailed testing of super advanced mobile forensic scenarios. The blog covers his research on the cutting edge of what's now called proximity forensics. CAS data is one of the original applications of proximity forensics. The defendant would say something like, I was never at X place, and the phone places him there. Proximity forensics moved to co-location of phones. A scenario might be that a suspect meets a victim, CAS data showed two phones went into a car together to a particular location, and only one phone came back, or two phones connected to the same Wi-Fi. The latest cutting-edge phase of proximity forensics appears to assume that a phone is in a state in which it can't locate itself, like when Wi-Fi is off, or the phone is physically powered off. Either that, or the phone's owner intentionally doesn't want the phone to be located. This new phase is facilitated by features that log GPS locations to either device itself or communicate a beacon to another device that either then passes the GPS coordinates to the cloud to be found later, or encrypts and logs the location information locally on the other phone. Devices rarely prove the physical crime, but do prove that the device was where the crime likely took place. Let's see what some of Mr. Hickman's very technical research has to say in terms everybody can understand. First, he mentions the Idaho4 case. In a 22 March 2026 post entitled Old Dog, New Tricks, Lost Apples 2.0, he says, "There have been some interesting cases in the news lately that have caused me to give some thought about devices being in proximity to each other, and how to prove that proximity, especially when those who are intent on doing harm are going dark prior to doing their bad deeds." This raised the question, is there a way to determine proximity when a device is powered off? Yes, that's the right question that we hope he'll answer. The link is to an article about the Idaho4 case, but there's actually little or no information in that post that would be applicable to the Idaho4 case. But I'm feeling like we're getting closer. Stay with me for just a bit more important context from one of my previous videos. The phone that Mr. Kohberger had essentially operates the same way as an Android tracking device when its find feature has been activated for being powered off, as a result of being powered off or having the Wi-Fi turned off. We also know that Mr. Kohberger's phone model begins assuming that it's lost 30 minutes after being powered off or having that Wi-Fi turned off. When Mr. Hickman talks about unwanted trackers, he means Android devices that are beaconing as if they're lost devices, but not being searched for by an iPhone user. Basically, he's talking about random Androids in find mode that are close in proximity to the iPhone. All right, back on track. The more interesting post is actually from Mr. Hickman's 2 September 2024 blog entry entitled "Where the Wild Tags Are and Other AirTag Stories." He says, "I recently gave a presentation and wrote a blog post that, among other things, discussed unwanted Google Find My Device trackers and how they were detected by Android and iOS devices. While I was still finalizing my slide deck for that presentation, I stumbled across something interesting in the iOS unified logs. Information about unwanted trackers was being written to disk. After some digging, Googling, and yelling at my keyboard, I discovered that examiners do have a way to obtain location data about where an iPhone was when it saw the unwanted tracker, AirTag, or otherwise. But then, to my disappointment, iOS 17.5 came up again, as it always seems to. Google Find My Device trackers involve their interactions with. As of iOS 17.5, devices now have the ability to detect unwanted trackers that operate on the Google Find My Device network." I almost flipped over to a different task, but decided to keep reading and at least see what the forensic data was available in iOS 17.5. You can see that data would be as compelling as the SmartThings Find location. You have the trigger date when the iPhone logged the data about the Android beacon. You have a series of GPS-generated exact latitudes and longitudes. That's interesting, but again, not really relevant because of the iOS 17.5 requirements that didn't come to pass until 2024. And then two things caught my eye. First, if the device being examined is running any version of iOS prior to 17.5, the key needed to decrypt the encrypted BP list is different. Wait, what do you mean any version prior to iOS 17.5? And then second, these .record files for unwanted trackers go back to at least iOS 15.3.1. Wait, iOS 15.3.1? When did that release? So these files are being logged as far back as February 2022. Boom. Mr. Hickman wrote in a 23 August 2024 post entitled, "Not All Androids Who Wander Are Lost, a look at Android's Find My Device network." He says, "There is good news, however. While prepping for the SAN Summit," which is a big digital forensics and cybersecurity summit, while prepping for the SAN Summit presentation, I discovered that unwanted Find My Device tracker information is stored on disk in iOS. It is encrypted, but I was able to determine how to decrypt it." So now everything fits together. The crime took place in November 2022. Mr. Kohberger had an Android that he turned off, and there were 6 iPhone devices in the house with iOS version at least 15.3.1. The phone that Mr. Kohberger had would have been acting like a lost device, waiting for Find My Device to do its magic. We know from Josh Hickman's research that iPhones would log Android Find My Device beacons going back as far as February 2022. Cellebrite says they found a file and gave Josh Hickman credit for helping them decrypt that file. What does that mean? If that similarly formatted file that Josh Hickman posted in his blog, and I've shown in this video, then that file contains a GPS latitude and longitude placing Mr. Kohberger's phone at the crime scene, either on the night of the crime or when he had his Wi-Fi off in the days leading up to the crime.
In the report that I received today, there was a reference to a drines.json file. What's that?
It was a JSON file that was inside the Cassidy's session notes.
What does that depict?
It's just data that Cassidy's would use, I'm guessing, to replot something on the map to actually show locations or other things.
Did you do anything with that file when you found it yesterday?
I did open that file, yes.
Okay. What did that show you when you opened it?
There were references to 2 locations inside it.
When you open it, what does it just say, here's 2 references, or what does it show you when you open it?
It's different code, but there is some plain language or plain English, plain text inside of that code that show 2 addresses.
Last week, we received some additional records that Detective Mowry found when he was preparing for his testimony on this mission to help. Have you had a chance to review those records?
I have. A couple of them are very technical, so I'm not going to say that I've mastered them yet. I have a good idea of what was provided and what it means.
Sounds like those might be pretty important to us defending Mr. Kohberger.
I could give examples, but I know it's a very technical thing, so I'm not. It could be extremely impactful to either side. I'm not saying just in defending Mr. Kohberger. It could be extremely impactful in prosecuting Mr. Kohberger.
Length about some encrypted GPS coordinates that allegedly placed my client at the crime scene on the night of the crime. That's not going to happen. Defense attorneys don't do that. The prosecution has little motivation to disclose what might be smoking gun evidence until the trial. And then after the defendant pleads guilty, as Mr. Kohberger did, now they have zero motivation to make that public. Plus, we also have to deal with the fact that it may be in the state's and FBI's best interest to keep this technique quiet. But the prosecutor said they had no evidence of Mr. Kohberger ever being at the 1122 King Road property. Bill Thompson makes 2 important statements at the plea hearing. The first is that the state's evidence will show that Mr. Kohberger parked behind the residence, walked down the hill, and entered the sliding glass door.
And the state's evidence would show that the defendant's car came back and parked behind and above the 1122 King Road residence.
The second is a misinterpretation of the quote that he makes about Mr. Kohberger not being at the 1122 King Road residence. That quote actually starts with,
Between July 9th of 2022 and November 7th, the defendant's phone connected to that particular tower during late night, early morning hours, 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., on approximately 23 times. Now, I will acknowledge also, we do not have evidence that the defendant had direct contact with 1122 or with residents of 1122, but we can put his phone in that area on those times.
And we know from the Cellebrite evidence that Mr. Kohberger began to turn off his Wi-Fi a few days before the crime.
But then, right as we lead up to the days of the crime about to happen, he went in and turned off his Wi-Fi on his phone. So he didn't want it to connect to anything, which is quite odd.
Hopefully now we can all understand the level of confidence that Bill Thompson and the Cellebrite team have. I would argue that the prosecution team can remain confident, even at a retrial, that they'll be able to place Mr. Kohberger at the 1122 King Road residence. And as I stated in my very first video, Mr. Kohberger's phone is likely part of the evidence that compelled him to plead guilty. I'll also just quickly address one objection that a particular creator is bound to have about how Mr. Kohberger drove to the scene. I saw his video where Cy Ray states that Route 270 is the quote, most surveilled route, end quote. And we'll have a future video easily debunking this. Spoiler alert, there isn't a single state government camera between Pullman and Moscow on Route 270. If you like my videos and how I present the information, please subscribe and like the video.